My name is Anatoly. For 42 years, I have been the sole keeper of a secret that lives and breathes at the summit of the Caucasus Mountains. A secret entombed in ice and silence. I was once a man of science, a glaciologist for the Soviet Union, stationed here at the Kazbek Meteorological Outpost. This place is so remote, it feels like a forgotten punctuation mark at the end of the world's longest sentence. Now, I am just an old man who knows how to read the ice. I am breaking my silence tonight because the ice is finally melting, and some secrets cannot remain frozen forever. Before I die, you must know what I saw. You must understand why these peaks must never be disturbed, and what terrible legacy we left buried here. I am going to tell you the story of the guardian of the mountain, and the terrible truth he spent a lifetime protecting from mankind. He was not a monster. He was a sentinel, and I was his only witness. The debt I owe him is this story, told in full, no matter the cost. My credibility is not found in dusty papers or academic accolades. It is etched into the frost on my windows and the permanent ache in my bones. I know the sound of a coming avalanche, not as a roar, but in the way the wind first thins to a sharp, high whisper. I can feel the groan of a glacier shifting, a vibration that travels from the bedrock, up through the soles of my boots, and into my soul. I know the specific, weighted silence that falls just before a whiteout blizzard consumes the world. A silence that is not empty, but full of impending violence. But there is another silence I know even better. My wife, Elena, used to say this profound isolation was a sickness I craved, a way to hide from the world. She was right, and in the end, she died of it, in a way, right here in this outpost, leaving me with a silence far heavier, far more permanent than any snowfall. It is a quiet that has a name, and that name is guilt. This story begins with that guilt. The year after she was gone, Elena was the warmth in this world of cold. Her voice could cut through the drone of the wind, her laughter a sound I can now barely recall. She tried, for years, to pull me back down the mountain, back to a life with people, with noise, with chaos. But the science, the solitude, I told myself it was important work, necessary. The truth is, I was a coward. I was more comfortable with the predictable anger of the ice than the unpredictable affections of people. When the fever took her, swift and brutal, the outpost's radio was my only link to a doctor miles and miles away. His advice was useless. The storm was too strong for any help to arrive. I held her hand as she grew cold. The only sound, the howling of the wind that I had once found so comforting. Her last breath was a quiet sigh, and in its wake, the silence she left behind became my true prison. I didn't just lose her. I had chosen this place over her, and I was left with the consequences. A man alone on top of the world, haunted by a ghost. It was in the throes of that suffocating guilt, almost exactly a year after her passing, that the mountain decided to speak. A storm hit the peak, but it was unlike any I had ever recorded in 3 decades of meticulous logs. This was not weather, it was a living thing. A vortex of wind and ice shards that didn't just blow, it screamed. For 2 full days and 2 full nights, the outpost shuddered, the metal groaning under the strain. It sounded like the mountain itself was being torn apart. I couldn't see past my own window, a solid wall of swirling white. The wind had a voice, 1,000 shrieking voices. And I sat in my chair, listening, half convinced it was the spirits of this place finally coming to claim me. I didn't care if they did. In a way, I was hoping for it. The noise was so absolute, so violent, that for the first time in a year, it drowned out the silence Elena had left behind. It was a temporary, brutal relief. On the second night, I fell into a restless sleep, the building shaking around me like a toy. On the third morning, I woke to an abrupt and total stillness, the kind of absolute quiet that hurts the ears. The storm had broken as suddenly as it began. But this was not the empty silence of my grief. This was something else. It was the silence I knew. The specific silence that falls before something happens. A held breath. I made my coffee, my hands shaking slightly, my senses on high alert. I was listening. For what? I didn't know. The first crack of a glacier settling? The whisper of a coming slide. And then I heard it. A sound that did not belong. It cut through the clean, cold air from the direction of the eastern ridge. It was a low, guttural moan. It wasn't the sound of wind in a crevasse or the groan of shifting ice. It was biological. It was the sound of pain, a sound of immense, impossible power brought low, and it was close. My every instinct, honed by years of survival, screamed at me to bolt the door and ignore it. But another instinct, a deeper one I thought had died with Elena, stirred. I had to know. Curiosity, or perhaps a death wish, took hold. I pulled on my warmest gear, my fingers clumsy with adrenaline, and grabbed my ice axe. The air outside was so cold, it felt like a physical blow to the lungs. The world was remade in white. The storm had dumped meters of fresh snow, carving new, treacherous shapes into the familiar landscape. I followed the sound, which came again. Weaker this time, a deep, shuddering exhalation. The snow was deep, the going slow and dangerous. Every step was a risk. One wrong move, and I would disappear into a hidden crevasse forever. After nearly an hour of careful, heart-pounding trekking, I came to the edge of what was, 2 days ago, a stable ice shelf. Now, it was a ruin. A massive section had collapsed into a deep bowl, a chaotic graveyard of ice blocks the size of small houses, and there, at the bottom, was the source of the sound. A patch of dark, matted fur against the pristine, shattered blue-white of the ice. It was huge, far bigger than any bear. My breath caught in my throat, pluming in the frigid air. I carefully made my way down the unstable slope, my axe biting into the ice for security. As I got closer, the scale of it became overwhelming. It was a creature of myth, the kind of story old men tell children to keep them from wandering too far into the snow. A Yeti. It was half buried in the snow and pinned by a slab of ice. Its massive form contorted in pain. One arm was free, a hand bigger than my torso lying palm up on the snow. But it was the wound that held my focus. A deep, gruesome gash in its shoulder, weeping a dark, thick blood that steamed in the cold. It wasn't an injury from the fall. It was too clean, too precise. Protruding from the torn flesh was a piece of rusted metal. It was not a rock, not shrapnel from the mountain. It was machined, with a strange curve to it, complex. It was something made by human hands, and it was the source of this creature's agony. He was dying, not from the storm, but from this violation. I stood there, maybe 20 meters away, my mind a whirlwind of terror and disbelief. The creature's head lifted slowly. Its eyes met mine. They were not the simple, reactive eyes of an animal. They were ancient, intelligent, and filled with a profound, weary pain. In that moment, the rest of the world ceased to exist. There was only me, this impossible being, and a choice. The mountain's logic was clear. Retreat, go back to the outpost, bolt the door, and let nature take its course. The wolves, the cold, they would finish this. No one would ever know. It was the safe choice, the sane choice. To interfere was madness. What could I even do? But then I looked at the wound, at that ugly piece of man-made metal embedded in its flesh, and I thought of Elena. I thought of my own failure to act, of my paralysis in the face of her suffering. I could not save her, but I could do something, here, now. This was my choice, a chance to pay a debt paid in silence. The decision was not made with logic. It was a primal, gut-level reaction against my own cowardice. I would not walk away, not again. I took a slow, deliberate step forward. The creature watched my every move, a low rumble beginning deep in its chest. It was a warning. I stopped. I held up my empty hands, then slowly, carefully, unclipped my geological hammer and a set of heavy-duty pliers from my belt. I laid them on the snow in front of me to show I meant no harm. The rumbling subsided, replaced by a ragged, painful breath. It understood. Or maybe it was simply too weak to care. I didn't know. I just knew I had to try. I moved forward again, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs, each beat a prayer. I was closing the distance to a myth, a god of this frozen place, with the intent to put my hands on it. The sheer insanity of my actions was not lost on me. I was a scientist, a man of facts and figures, and I was about to perform surgery on a monster from a fairy tale. I knelt beside it, the smell of wet fur and blood filling the air. That single choice, made in the shadow of the peaks, was the one that defined the rest of my life. It was the moment I stopped being the widower Anatoly, hiding from his ghosts, and became something else, a keeper. The work was agonizing. Hours spent in the biting cold, my fingers growing numb as I used my geological tools to carefully, painstakingly, work the metal shard from its shoulder. It watched me the entire time, its gaze heavy with an intelligence that was both terrifying and humbling. It never moved, never struggled, only breathing its labored, smoky breaths. When the shard finally came free, with a sickening tear of flesh, the creature let out a long, low sigh, and its head sank back into the snow. I did what little I could to clean the wound, then I retreated, leaving it there. I didn't know if it would live, but I knew I could never speak of this. This secret was mine alone. My isolation was no longer a punishment. It had become a necessity. It was a vow of silence, sealed in blood and ice. I now understand that my act of mercy 42 years ago was also an act of folly. That piece of metal I pulled from its shoulder, I kept it. It became my terrible, secret memento. For decades, I have lived a life intertwined with this creature, a silent pact between two solitary beings on the roof of the world. And now, the past has come to collect its due. The mountain cannot keep this secret forever. So I will tell you everything. I'll tell you how our silent ritual began. I will tell you how he saved my life. And I will tell you the truth of what he was guarding in that old Soviet bunker. A truth far more terrifying than any myth. It's a truth about a forgotten war, and what happens when our ambition creates legacies that require monsters to guard them. I only ask that you listen to the end. The full story deserves to be heard. If you are ready to hear the truth of what happened on this mountain, please show your support by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing this story with someone who needs to hear it. And please, stay with me until the very end. The silence is about to be broken. For days after, I did not venture far from the outpost. I expected to find the creature's body half-eaten by snow leopards or buried under a fresh drift. The silence of the mountain had returned, but it was different now. It was an observant silence. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper. Every shadow seemed to move just at the edge of my vision. I was no longer just a lonely man in a vast, empty landscape. I was a man with a secret, and the mountain itself felt like a co-conspirator. I would scan the collapsed ice shelf with my binoculars for hours, seeing nothing but the wind-scoured ice. The guilt I felt for Elena was now mingled with a new, strange anxiety. Had I done enough, or had I simply prolonged its suffering, a clumsy interference in a world I could never truly understand? I began to believe I had imagined it all, a hallucination born of grief and isolation, a desperate fiction my mind had created to give my solitude meaning. The sheer, logical impossibility of it all was a constant argument against my own memory. A debt paid in silence felt like a fool's bargain with a ghost. Then, one morning, a week after the storm, I saw it. Placed neatly on the flat stone that served as my front step was a piece of quartz crystal. This was not unusual. The mountain was full of them. But this one was different. It was the size of my fist, unnaturally clear, and polished to a perfect smoothness on all but one side, as if it had been rubbed against stone for years. When I picked it up, my thick glove on me, I could feel a faint, almost imperceptible vibration, a low thrum of energy that seemed to hum against my bones. It was cold, of course, but it felt like a living cold. It was a message. There were no tracks in the snow leading to the outpost, which had seen a fresh dusting overnight. It was simply there, a gift, an acknowledgement, an answer to the question I had been too afraid to ask. It was alive, and it knew where I lived. The crystal was a statement. I see you. The transaction had begun. The mountain was no longer just rock and ice. It was a partner in a silent conversation I was only just beginning to learn. I understood immediately that this was the other half of the equation. I had performed a service, and now a payment had been rendered. If this was to be a relationship, it had to be reciprocal. It could not be a one-time event. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind, the scientist's mind, raced with protocols and procedures. But this was a problem no manual could solve. The answer had to come from a more fundamental place. What does one offer a myth? What currency does a god of the snow trade in? I settled on the most basic, universal gestures: sustenance and care. I went to my stores, the precious supplies meant to last me through the winter. I gathered a small parcel of cured, salted meat and a handful of the tough, fibrous roots that Elena had taught me how to find and preserve. Roots that held their nutrients even in the deepest cold. It felt like a sacred offering. I wrapped them in a piece of clean burlap, a bundle of trust against the vast, indifferent landscape. I was preparing the next move in a game whose rules were being written with every action. The next morning, I had to decide on a drop point. It couldn't be too close to my outpost. That would be an invitation for it to encroach, a violation of my own fragile safety. It couldn't be too far, or the act of leaving the offering would become a life-threatening expedition in itself. I chose a place that felt like a compromise, a liminal space between my world and its. There was a small, shallow ice cave at the base of the first major ridgeline, a place sheltered from the worst of the wind, but not deep enough to be a true lair. It was a threshold. The journey there took me 40 minutes. The snow crunched under my boots. The only sound in the vast stillness. I felt watched the entire way, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck that was not from the cold. I reached the cave, its entrance a gaping mouth of blue ice. With a sense of reverence I did not know I possessed, I placed the burlap-wrapped parcel just inside the entrance, where it would be safe from the snow and visible to whatever passed by. Then I retreated, walking backwards for the first 100 meters, my eyes fixed on the dark opening. The following day, I returned. The anxiety on the trek back was a physical weight in my chest. What if the food was still there? What if a simple fox had taken it? That would mean the crystal was a coincidence. That my grand gesture was just a man leaving his precious food to rot in a cave. It would mean I was truly alone again. But when I reached the cave, the burlap parcel was gone. There were no tracks, no signs of a struggle, no scraps left behind. It had been accepted, and in its place, laid carefully where the parcel had been, were two new objects. They were bones, vertebrae, from the look of them, but they were larger and heavier than any animal I knew of in this region. Bigger even than a bear's. They were bleached white and polished smooth, almost like ivory. I picked them up, my mind reeling. This was it. The ritual was established. I leave food, it leaves artifacts. A strange, silent bartering system. My life now had a new rhythm, a weekly pilgrimage to the ice cave, a secret purpose that anchored my lonely existence. My scientific curiosity, however, was a difficult instinct to suppress. A few months into our silent exchanges, I broke the first unspoken rule. After dropping off my weekly offering, I didn't retreat. I hid myself in a rocky outcrop nearby, determined to wait and watch. I wanted to see it. After an hour, as the cold began to seep deep into my bones, a change occurred. It wasn't a sound, it was a feeling. The air grew heavy, static. A low, guttural growl echoed, not from the cave, but from the high ridge far above me. It was a sound that vibrated in my teeth, a clear and unambiguous message. You are crossing a line. I scrambled from my hiding place and hurried back to the outpost, the feeling of being watched now an oppressive, tangible force. I learned my lesson. The exchange was to be blind. The cave was our mailbox, and we were not to spy on the mailman. I was never to go beyond that first ridgeline. That was its territory, and I was a guest, not an owner. The second rule I learned concerned time. As the season cycled, I would sometimes catch a glimpse of him at a great distance, usually at dusk. A colossal, dark silhouette moving with impossible speed along the highest peaks, stark against the fading alpenglow. The temptation to grab my binoculars, to track its movement, was immense. Once, I did. I focused my lenses on the moving shape, my heart pounding with the thrill of discovery. It was miles away, but it stopped. It turned its massive head, and even from that impossible distance, I felt its gaze lock onto me. It didn't move. It just stood there, a statue of judgment on the roof of the world, until I lowered the binoculars, my hands trembling. It was another clear lesson. Dusk was its time, a private time. To observe it was to trespass. Our relationship existed in the objects we exchanged, not in stolen glances. This was a pact of mutual respect for each other's solitude. To violate it was to risk ending the only meaningful connection I had left in the world. The most important rule, the one that governed my very survival, was announced by a sound. It began one winter afternoon, a low, resonant hum. It was not the wind. It was deeper, more fundamental, a vibration that seemed to come from the bedrock itself, traveling up through the foundations of the outpost. I could feel it in the floorboards, in the cup of tea rattling on my table. I had never heard it before. Confused, I put on my coat to investigate. As I opened the door, a sheet of ice the size of a table slid from the roof and shattered on the spot where I would have been standing seconds later. I froze, the hum still vibrating in the air. Then, as quickly as it began, it stopped, and the familiar mountain silence rushed back in. It was a warning. I came to learn its meaning with terrifying precision. The hum was an order. Stay inside. Don't go out. The mountain is unstable. The hum before the silence was a warning, a message of protection sent from my unseen guardian. Over the years, the gifts became more personal, more perplexing. The strange bones and humming crystals were eventually supplemented with other items that showed a startling level of observation. One autumn, I lost a small, specialized sensor from a weather array during a fierce gale. I searched for it for days, but it was gone, buried under a fresh layer of snow. A month later, I found it sitting on the offering stone in the ice cave, nestled beside the usual polished bone. It was cleaned of all snow and ice, placed there for me to find. It could not have known its function, but it knew it was mine. It knew I had lost it. This act went beyond a simple exchange of goods. It was an act of partnership. It was watching my life, my routines, my struggles, from its hidden vantage point. I was no longer just the provider of food. I was a subject of intense, silent study by an ancient intelligence I could barely comprehend. My small life had become part of its vast, mountainous world. All this time, I kept the metal shard. I stored it in my old footlocker, wrapped in Elena's last woolen scarf. Sometimes, late at night, I would take it out. I had cleaned it carefully. It was a complex, layered alloy, surprisingly light for its strength. On one edge, almost completely worn away by time and the elements, were the faint traces of Cyrillic lettering. I could only make out two letters, ZW, ZV, and a fragment of a number, maybe a 7. It was undeniably a piece of high-level Soviet technology, but from a program I had never heard of. It felt dangerous to possess. It was the original sin of my new life, the proof of a violent encounter. I was its keeper, but the shard was mine. It was a constant, cold reminder that my guardian, this creature I had come to call Kholod, the Russian word for cold, was not just a natural wonder. He was wounded. He had a history tied to men like me. It was the scar from a forgotten war. The years passed like the slow, grinding crawl of a glacier. My hair turned from gray to white. The lines on my face deepened into a map of the windswept terrain outside. The weekly ritual at the ice cave was the unchangeable center of my life. It was my church, my work, my family. The grief for Elena never left, of course. It was a part of me, like the ache in my joints. But it was no longer a suffocating silence. It was a quiet space now shared with another solitary soul. Our silent conversations, through gifts of bone and root, had filled the void she left with a new and profound sense of purpose. I was no longer just a man waiting to die. I was a guardian's guardian, a witness to the last true mystery of the world. My life had meaning because I was the only human who knew Kholod existed, and I was the only one he trusted. That trust was my most precious possession, more valuable than any data I had ever collected. That trust was tested and proven on a brutal day in my 37th year on the mountain. A blizzard had raged for a day, and I had to go out to clear a crucial sensor line that was in danger of collapsing under the weight of the snow. The wind was a physical force, pushing and pulling, and the snow was a blinding, disorienting wall of white. I was halfway to the sensor when I became turned around. The outpost, only a few hundred meters away, had vanished. Panic, cold and sharp, set in. I was lost in a whiteout, a death sentence at this altitude. I struggled on, my breath growing ragged, my limbs heavy and numb. Then, through the swirling chaos, I saw them. A line of deep, punched footprints in the snow. They were enormous, spaced far apart, a clear and deliberate path leading away into the white. It was not a random trail. It was a guide. It was a lifeline. With the last of my strength, I followed them, one staggering step at a time, until the dark shape of my outpost emerged from the blizzard. I collapsed against the door, fumbling with the latch before tumbling inside. Safe. Kholod had saved my life. He hadn't just appeared. He had understood my plight from afar and laid a path for me, an act of supreme intelligence and care. He had risked exposing himself in the storm to guide his clumsy, fragile human partner back to safety. The pact was no longer just about food and trinkets. It had been elevated. This was a bond forged in mutual preservation. He was not just an anomaly I was studying from a distance. He was my protector. The debt was now shared. He had returned the favor of that first intervention when I had pulled the metal from his shoulder with an act of equal, if not greater, significance. I sat on the floor, shaking from cold and relief, and I understood that my life was now inextricably bound to his. My survival depended on him, and perhaps, in a way I didn't yet understand, his depended on me. I never broke the rules again. I understood them now, not as restrictions, but as a grammar of respect. The third ridgeline was his private home, and I would no more intrude upon it than I would want him standing over my bed as I slept. The dusk was his time for solitude, a peace I knew well and would not disturb. And the hum. The hum was the voice of the mountain itself, channeled through him, a friendly warning between neighbors about a loose bit of roof or a dangerous patch of ice. Our ritual continued, but it was imbued with a new weight, a new depth. I was no longer just feeding a stray animal. I was tending to a king in exile. But the questions only deepened. What was he, really? And what was he doing here, alone on this peak, for all these years? The metal shard in my footlocker felt heavier than ever, a dark premonition of an answer I was not sure I was ready to receive. The years that followed were a slow, quiet deepening, like a river carving a canyon through stone. Our ritual was the water, and the bond was the canyon. The gifts Kolod left became more thoughtful. One spring, after a particularly harsh winter had frozen my well solid for a month, forcing me to melt snow for every drop of water, I found him waiting for me. Not him, precisely, but his guidance. A new series of deep, deliberate tracks led me away from our usual path, up a treacherous, unfamiliar goat trail. The trail ended at a place I had never seen before, a new freshwater spring, melted open high on the mountain face, gurgling with water so pure and cold it ached in my teeth. He hadn't just found water. He had understood my need. He had observed my struggle from his perch and provided a solution. The gesture was so profound, so specific, that it left me breathless. It was no longer a trade. It was a partnership. Our two solitary lives were now interwoven by the simple, brutal logistics of survival on this peak. My continued existence here was now a shared project. The most moving moment, the one that truly cemented our strange union, happened on the anniversary of Elena's death. It was a day I always spent in silent reflection, a day where the ghost in my outpost felt particularly close. I did my chores numbly, the weight of my guilt a physical presence. Late in the afternoon, I took my binoculars, not to spy, but to scan the horizon, a habit as ingrained as breathing. I saw him then, a colossal dark shape on a distant ridge. He wasn't moving. He wasn't foraging or patrolling his territory. He was sitting, perfectly still, like one of the granite tors that dotted the landscape. He was a statue of patience and immense power. His posture was not one of rest, but of vigil. He was simply sitting there, a giant figure of matted fur and ancient wisdom, staring. He held this position for hours, unmoving as the sun dipped and painted the snow in shades of orange and pink. He did not stir until the last light had faded from the sky, and the stars began to poke through the deepening twilight of the high altitude. Curiosity got the better of me. I had to understand what held his attention for so long with such complete focus. I adjusted the focus on my binoculars, trying to trace his line of sight down the vast, sweeping slopes of the mountain. It took me a moment to find the exact spot, to align my perspective with his. And then I saw it. My heart seized in my chest. He was not looking at a hunting ground or a rival's territory. His gaze was fixed on the small, windswept shelf of rock far below, the one just a few hundred meters from my outpost. The place marked by a simple, unadorned wooden cross I had carved myself. The place where Elena was buried. He was not just looking. He was mourning with me. This creature of myth, this being of ice and snow, was sharing my grief. It was an act of empathy so profound, so unexpected, that tears froze on my cheeks. In his stillness, he had given voice to the silence I carried. In that moment, he ceased to be it, or the creature. He was Kolod, and he was my only friend. The first sound of the new threat was not a roar or a crack of ice. but a thin, high-pitched whine. It was an unnatural noise, the buzz of a giant, angry insect. And it was a sound that had no place in the sacred silence of the peaks. My blood ran cold. I knew that sound from news reports and documentaries. It was the sound of a drone. The outside world, with its relentless curiosity and its all-seeing eyes, had finally arrived. For the first few days, it was a distant annoyance, a speck buzzing over the lower slopes, but it was a harbinger, a signal that my isolated kingdom was no longer inviolable. The mountain was no longer a fortress, it was becoming a destination. This sanctuary, built on a foundation of silence and mutual trust, was now under siege by the most mundane of enemies: tourism. They weren't malicious, not in the way a hunter is. They were worse. They were careless. Their desire for a spectacle, for a video to share online, had no regard for the sanctity of what they were filming. They saw a backdrop, not a home. They were adventure tourists, dropped by helicopter on a lower plateau, armed with high-end cameras and drones capable of flying in the thin, cold air. They saw the jagged peaks and pristine snowfields as a playground, a challenge to be conquered and documented. To me, their laughter, carried on the wind from miles below, sounded like a desecration. My outpost, my lonely sanctuary, suddenly felt terribly exposed. I began to feel a constant, simmering paranoia. Every time I stepped outside, I felt as if I were being watched, not by the ancient eyes of Kolod, but by the unblinking lens of a camera. I started to conduct my weekly offering to the ice cave under the cover of pre-dawn darkness, my movements furtive and hurried, like a criminal. The simple, sacred ritual had become a covert operation, fraught with the new risk of exposure. The joy of the exchange was replaced by a gnawing anxiety. The drone's buzzing was the theme music to my new, private hell. My world had shrunk to the size of my secret. Kolod disappeared. In the days following the drone's arrival, the mountain became empty again. The offerings of meat and roots I left in the ice cave were still taken, always in the dead of night. But the reciprocal gifts of polished bones and strange, humming crystals stopped. The conversation had ceased. The silence that returned was not the comfortable silence of companionship, but the tense, unnerving silence of fear. He was in hiding, driven into the deepest, most inaccessible parts of his territory by the persistent, alien buzz of the machine. I would scan the high ridges for hours, seeing nothing. The lack of his presence was a constant, hollow ache. The drone had poisoned our world. It had reminded him of a danger I did not fully understand, a danger that made him retreat into total invisibility. I felt a surge of protective rage, a feeling so fierce it surprised me. They were not just trespassing on a piece of land. They were threatening the last meaningful thing in my life. The breaking point arrived on a spectacularly clear, cold morning. The kind of day where the air is so sharp and clean you can see for 100 kilometers. The drone pilots, emboldened by the perfect weather, grew careless. From my window, I watched in horror as their machine, a black speck against the brilliant blue sky, flew higher and farther than ever before. It crested the first ridgeline, the boundary I had learned never to cross. It was heading directly for the ice cave, for our sacred meeting place. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it, the ultimate violation. I was frozen, a helpless spectator to the impending disaster. I knew what would happen. The drone would capture an image of the cave, perhaps even the entrance to his true lair beyond, and the questions would begin. The analysis, the expeditions, the end of everything. I was about to witness the murder of a secret agent live and in high definition. My debt paid in silence was about to be cashed in by a stranger with a remote control. And then, he appeared. He did not emerge cautiously. He exploded from a snowdrift near the cave, a being of pure, unrestrained fury. He was no longer the quiet sentinel or the grieving friend. He was a force of nature, a mountain god woken from his slumber. A roar tore through the silent air, a sound of such primal power that it vibrated through the glass of my window. It was the sound of a territory being defended, of a final line being crossed. He was immense, a towering silhouette of dark fur and enraged muscle against the white snow, ready to smash the buzzing insect out of his sky. I knew, with absolute certainty, that if he touched that drone, it was over, even if he destroyed it. The memory card would likely survive the fall. The footage of a mythical creature attacking a drone would be the story of the century. The world would descend on this mountain, my mountain, with helicopters and soldiers and scientists. They would hunt him down. They would not stop until they had him. My mind, usually so slow and methodical, raced with a desperate, frantic energy. I couldn't let it happen. I had to intervene, to stop him from revealing himself. But how? Shouting was useless. Firing a rifle at the drone was just as bad. The gunshot would attract attention, and a bullet hole would be evidence of human interference. I needed a distraction, something big, loud, and, most importantly, something that seemed like an act of the mountain itself. My eyes scanned my small living space and landed on the bright red emergency kit by the door. Inside was my flare gun and several small percussion-activated charges for triggering controlled avalanches in rescue situations. It was an incredibly dangerous idea. A miscalculation could bury the cave, or me, or trigger a much larger slide. But it was the only idea I had. To protect the secret, I had to use the mountain's own fury. I had to make my home a place of terror. The scar from a forgotten war was about to be joined by a new one of my own making. In a flash, I was outside. The brutal cold a slap to the face. My hands, clumsy with adrenaline, fumbled with the flare gun. I didn't aim at the drone. I didn't aim anywhere near Kolod. I aimed far to the east, at a different slope altogether, where I knew a massive, unstable cornice of snow hung precariously over a steep drop. It was a calculated risk, based on decades of observing this mountain's weaknesses. I braced myself, pointed the gun at the sky over the cornice, and fired. The thump of the launch was immediately followed by the brilliant red arc of the flare against the blue sky. For a second, nothing happened. Then came the sound. A deep, sickening crack that echoed across the peaks, followed by a low, growing rumble. A plume of white smoke erupted from the cornice, and then the entire wall of snow gave way, thundering down the mountain in a majestic, terrifying river of white. It was a beautiful and horrifying sight. The avalanche was small by the mountain standards, but it was more than enough. The deep, guttural roar of thousands of tons of moving snow and ice was the most convincing warning imaginable. I saw the drone wobble, then turn sharply, zipping back down the mountain with a speed I hadn't seen before. Far below, I could just make out the tiny figures of the tourists scrambling away in panic. They wouldn't be back. They would tell stories of the mountain's instability. Of its sudden, unpredictable violence. I had succeeded. I had turned my home into a monster to protect the monster who lived here. When I turned my gaze back to the ice cave, my heart pounding with a mixture of triumph and terror, Kolod was gone. The snow was empty. The only sound was the fading rumble of the avalanche and the frantic beating of my own heart. The silence he left behind this time was one of judgment. I did not know if I had saved our pact or broken it forever. The cost of my action settled in over the following days. The mountain was quiet again, but the silence was different. It was the silence of a fortress. My isolation, which had once been a wound, then a comfort, and then a shared state of being, was now a conscious, active strategy. I was no longer just a resident. I was the warden. I had weaponized my knowledge of this place, turning its natural dangers into a shield to protect its deepest secret. It was a heavy burden to carry. Every gust of wind now sounded like an approaching helicopter. Every shadow seemed to hold a hidden observer. The paranoia that had been a low hum had grown into a constant shriek in the back of my mind. My quiet life of observation had become a lonely, unending vigil against the entire outside world. I had saved Kolod from exposure, but I had imprisoned myself in the process. This place was no longer a refuge. It was a cage of my own making. The weekly ritual resumed a few days later, but the atmosphere had changed. The offering was taken, and a single, polished piece of black obsidian was left in its place, a stone I had never seen in this region. It felt less like a gift and more like a symbol, a piece of darkness, a mirror. The incident had raised a terrifying question that I could no longer ignore. Kolod's violent reaction had not just been about being seen. I had seen him react with similar, albeit less dramatic, panic to the distant sound of geological survey helicopters years before. It was the technology itself that provoked him. The buzzing drone, the rhythmic thumping of rotor blades, the piece of machined metal I had pulled from his shoulder all those years ago. They were all connected. He wasn't just hiding from people, he was hiding from what people create. The question that haunted my sleepless nights was no longer what he was, but what he was so desperately guarding this mountain from. The emotional turning point, the moment that truly broke me and remade me, came not in a storm or a confrontation, but in the quiet betrayal of my own body. It was in my 37th year of this vigil. My heart, a tired old pump worn thin by age, altitude, and a lifetime of unprocessed grief, finally gave out. I was checking a sensor line about a kilometer from the outpost, a routine I'd done thousands of times. There was no warning, just a sudden, crushing pressure in my chest, a fire spreading down my left arm, and the world tilting violently on its axis. My last conscious thought was of the snow rushing up to meet my face, the cold a final, shocking kiss. I remember thinking, with a strange sense of calm, so, this is it. It's finally over. The silence I had lived in for so long was about to become permanent. I was consumed by the white, a fitting end for a man who had hidden from the world in a landscape of ice. It felt, in a way, like justice. I woke up hours later. The first sensation was not cold, but a deep, throbbing ache that radiated from every muscle in my body. My mind was a fog of confusion. I was not face down in the snow. I was lying on my back, my head propped against the rough wood of my own outpost door. The sky above was a brilliant, star-dusted purple of deep twilight. I was alive. I tried to push myself up, but my body screamed in protest. It felt as if I'd been dragged, pulled across a kilometer of unforgiving terrain. How? My mind struggled to form a coherent thought. I was too weak to have crawled. No person could have found me, let alone moved me. As my vision cleared, I saw the deep, furrowed trench in the snow leading from my body back into the distance, back towards the place where I had fallen. A single, wide track, as if a great weight had been hauled through the deep powder. And then I knew. He had found me. But it was what I saw next to me that shattered the last of my scientific detachment and exposed the raw, beating heart of our connection. There, on the snow beside my head, was a small, carefully placed pile of mountain herbs. It was not a random collection of foliage. My breath caught in my throat, a painful, ragged gasp. They were the same rare, medicinal herbs Elena had spent years teaching me to identify. The ones with the small, purple flowers that only grew in the most sheltered, sun-facing crevices. She used to make a tea from them, a bitter brew she swore was good for the heart, for chest pain, for inflammation. It was a piece of knowledge that belonged to me and her alone, a secret buried in my memory for decades. And Kolod, my silent, monstrous friend, had not only saved me from the snow, he had shown me a memory. He had brought me medicine. In that moment, lying half frozen and broken at my own doorstep, I finally understood. He had been watching me for all these years, not just my movements, but my life. He had seen me tending Elena's grave. He had observed my lonely routines, my private griefs. He had learned me. This was not the act of a beast protecting its food source. This was an act of profound care, of empathy that transcended species, that transcended language. It was a gesture that felt like forgiveness. Forgiveness for what? I did not know. Perhaps forgiveness on behalf of the mountain for my intrusion. Or perhaps it was something deeper, a shared understanding of loss, a gesture that said, I will not let you be lost as she was lost. I wept then. For the first time since Elena's death, hot tears that froze on my weathered cheeks. My debt was not just paid in silence anymore. It was paid in a shared soul. He had not just saved my body, he had rescued my humanity. After my recovery, a slow and painful process, something fundamental shifted in our ritual. The pact of non-interference was subtly amended. Kolod began to guide me again, but his purpose had changed. The weekly offerings continued, but now, he would leave tracks for me to follow, not to survival resources, but to specific destinations. He was no longer just a protector. He had become a teacher, and he was insistent that his lesson be learned. The paths he chose were old, forgotten trails, places I had never ventured in all my decades on the peak. He would lead me on these new journeys, always waiting, a distant, patient shadow on a high ridge until I reached the spot he had chosen. Then, he would disappear back into the mists and rock. The mountain was no longer just a landscape. It was becoming a text, and Kolod was showing me how to read its most secret chapter. His silent guidance now had an urgency I had never felt before. He led me to the same spot, time and time again, from different directions, as if to ensure I could not mistake its significance. It was a sheer, unremarkable rock face, perpetually shadowed and disguised by a permanent, wind-hardened snowdrift that clung to it like a shroud. To any observer, it was just another part of the mountain's brutal architecture. I was confused. Why here? There were no rare minerals, no hidden springs, no unique geological formations. It was just rock. Yet, Kolod was resolute. After each trek, I would find him at a distance, watching me, his stillness a question. Do you see? It became a new kind of ritual, this pilgrimage to a blank wall of stone. I started sketching it in my logbook, mapping the cracks and fissures, convinced I was missing something obvious. I felt like a student failing a simple test, the answer hovering just beyond my comprehension. The silent pressure to understand was immense. One afternoon, as I stood before the rock face for perhaps the dozenth time, frustrated and cold, Kolod did something new. He had led me there, and then, instead of retreating to a distant ridge, he descended, moving with his terrifying, silent grace. He came to a halt not 50 meters from me, the closest he had been since that first, terrible day of his injury. My heart hammered, but it was not with fear. It was with anticipation. He turned his massive form to the wall of snow and rock. With one colossal arm, he began to sweep away the packed snowdrift, not with rage, but with the deliberate, focused effort of an excavator. Tons of snow were tossed aside as if they were dust. He was uncovering something, and as the ancient ice and snow were cleared away, I saw it. Beneath the natural camouflage was not rock. It was a deep, rust-red scar of pitted steel. A door, a massive, heavy industrial steel door, set directly into the mountain itself. I stumbled forward, my mind reeling. This was impossible. This peak was supposed to be virgin territory, a place untouched by major construction. But this door was undeniably real, and it was old. It was sealed shut, its edges fused with decades of ice. In the center of the door, faded but still legible, was an insignia. It was a symbol I had not seen in 40 years, a symbol that belonged to the ghost stories of the Cold War, a stylized atom, interwoven with a snowflake. My blood ran cold. I knew that mark. It was the emblem of a top-secret, almost mythical Soviet program from the 1970s. A cryogenics and biological enhancement division so secret, even mentioning its name, was grounds for a trip to a Siberian gulag. We called it the Frostbite Project, in hushed whispers. It was a rumor, a paranoid fantasy. But the door was real. The ghost was real. As I stood there, staring at the faded insignia, trying to reconcile the impossible reality before me, Kolod did the one thing that connected all the disparate, terrifying pieces of my life on this mountain. He moved closer to the steel door, the scale of it making even his immense form seem proportionate. He reached out with one huge, dark hand, the long, thick fingers, ending in what looked like black, obsidian claws. With a single, surprisingly gentle finger, he tapped the center of the steel door. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was dull, heavy, final. Then, he turned his great head and looked directly at me. Slowly, with a deliberateness that was horrifying in its clarity, he raised his other hand and pointed. He did not point at me. He did not point at the sky. He pointed to the old, gnarled, puckered scar on his own shoulder, the place where I had dug out that piece of machined metal all those years ago. The revelation hit me not as a thought, but as a physical blow, with the force of an avalanche. The door, the wound, the metal shard in my footlocker with the letters Zaivi etched on it. They were all the same story. He wasn't just showing me a hidden bunker. He was showing me the source of his agony. He was showing me where he came from, or what he had been fighting. My mind flashed back to the shard, that complex piece of layered alloy. It wasn't from a weapon that had been fired at him. It was a piece of something that had broken, a piece of a cage. The scar from a forgotten war. The war was here, sealed behind this door. He was not a monster from myth. He was a survivor, or a guard. My role, my entire life for the past 4 decades, was recontextualized in a single, silent gesture. I wasn't just hiding a creature. I was hiding a witness to a secret that governments would kill to keep buried. I was torn between a desperate, consuming need to understand the truth and a primal, instinctual terror of opening that door. The secret of Kolod's existence was one thing. The secret of a forgotten Soviet cryogenics bunker was another entirely. This was a truth that didn't belong to me. To investigate further felt like a betrayal of the silent trust Kolod had placed in me, but to ignore it felt like a different kind of betrayal. A failure to understand the true nature of his lifelong burden. He had finally shown me the source of his pain, the ghost that haunted him just as Elena's ghost haunted me. I now understood his violent reaction to the drone and the helicopters. They were the echoes of his captors, or his enemy. My small, isolated world had suddenly connected to a history of unimaginable ambition and cruelty. I was no longer a hermit. I was a conspirator. The truth of what I did next, and what happened when the past finally came to reclaim its property, is the reason I am telling this story. The stakes became higher than my own life. They involved the legacy of a nation and the soul of this mountain. If you're finding value in this confession, if you believe that some secrets need to be told, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Share it, so that this story does not die with me. And please, stay until the end. You need to hear what was waiting behind that door. Their arrival was not announced by the roar of an engine, but by its absence. I was awake, watching the stars in the ink-black sky, when a new star appeared, a darkness that blotted out the constellations as it descended. There was no thunder of rotors, just a low, predatory whoomp, whoomp, whoomp that the thin air barely carried, a sound designed to go unheard. It was a high-altitude military helicopter, painted a matte black that swallowed the moonlight. It didn't land. Ropes dropped into the swirling snow kicked up by its downdraft, and silent figures slid down with a fluid efficiency that spoke of endless, brutal training. They were not a border patrol. They were Spetsnaz, ghosts in white camouflage, their faces obscured by goggles and balaclavas. They moved with the chilling purpose of wolves, securing the perimeter of my outpost before I even had time to process that my world, my entire secret life, had just ended. My isolation had been breached not by a careless tourist, but by the state itself. A cold older than ice had finally come to my door. The man who knocked was their commander. He was a captain, young but with eyes that were ancient and devoid of warmth, the color of glacial ice. He introduced himself as Captain Volkov and informed me, in a voice that was polite but held the unyielding hardness of steel, that my outpost was being temporarily commandeered for a sensitive asset recovery mission. He spoke of thermal satellites, of a unique biological and energy anomaly that had been detected in my sector. He said my cooperation was expected as a matter of national security. I played the part of a confused, slightly senile old man, a hermit startled by the modern world. I offered them tea. He politely declined, his gaze sweeping over every detail of my small, cluttered life, his eyes lingering on my logbooks, on the map of the peaks pinned to my wall. He did not believe my act for a second. In that moment, the outpost ceased to be my home. It was an interrogation room, a forward operating base, and a prison, and I was its sole, terrified inmate, suddenly accountable for a life I had lived entirely in secret. The questions began that very day, and continued for what felt like an eternity. They were not violent, but they were relentless, a slow, methodical grinding away of my defenses. Captain Volkov would sit across from me at my own small table. My decades of meticulous weather logs spread between us. Did you ever record seismic tremors that did not correspond to known fault lines, Mr. Anatoly? Have you ever heard vocalizations that you could not attribute to any known local fauna? Tell me about the storm of '81. The logs show a barometric drop unlike anything seen before or since. I lied. I lied with the desperation of a drowning man. I spoke of wind whistling through crevasses, of ice shifts, of the groans of the glacier. I wove a tapestry of half-truths and plausible deniability, my heart a frantic bird in my chest. All the while, he watched me, his icy gaze never blinking, letting the silence after each of my answers hang in the air, heavy with his disbelief. The weight of my 42-year secret was a physical pressure, threatening to crack me open. While the captain dissected my past, his technicians dissected my present. They moved through my small station with quiet, invasive competence, sweeping every surface for electronics, for signals, for hidden compartments. I watched them run a magnetometer over the old wooden footlocker where I kept Elena's scarf and the metal shard. My blood turned to ice. That night, under the sliver of a new moon, While the guards were changing shifts, I committed my most desperate act. I retrieved the shard. It felt warm in my freezing hand. A cursed talisman. I slipped outside, a ghost in my own home, and buried it deep beneath the loose rock of Elena's grave, praying the disturbed ground would be mistaken for the work of Frost Heave. When I returned, the outpost felt different, violated. The familiar scents of wood smoke and old paper were now tainted with the sterile smell of electronics and gun oil. The silence I cherished was gone, replaced by the constant "Shapiki ein, wen iki fur," low crackle of their radios, and the silent judgment of men who saw me as a variable in an equation. The day for my weekly offering arrived. To not go would be a signal to both Kolod and the soldiers that something was wrong. My only chance was to brazen it out. I bundled up some dried meat, explaining to the watchful guard at my door that it was a foolish habit of mine, leaving scraps for the snow foxes. The captain, overhearing, gave a slight, chilling smile. "A sentimental man, Mr. Anatoly. See that you are not followed too closely. We would not want to frighten your foxes." The walk to the ice cave was the longest of my life. I felt the crosshairs on my back with every step. I knew they were out there, nested in the rocks, their thermal scopes turning my body into a glowing orange silhouette against the blue snow. I placed the parcel at the cave entrance, my hands shaking so badly I could barely function. I tried to project an air of calm, of routine, for whatever eyes were watching, human or otherwise. I did not know if Kolod would understand the new, terrible context of our ritual. Our sacred pact was now being performed on a stage for a hostile audience. The offering was taken, but my heart sank when I checked the next day. The space in the cave was empty. No polished bone, no humming crystal, no gesture of acknowledgement. The conversation had been severed. Kolod was silent, but he was not gone. At night, I started to hear it. A new sound carried on the wind from the highest, most inaccessible ridges. It was a low, intermittent growl of pure frustration, the sound of a king trapped in his own kingdom. He knew they were here, and his rage was echoing across the peaks. My guilt was a physical sickness. I had led them here. My act of mercy was the root of this invasion. The captain noticed the change as well. His questioning grew more pointed. "The anomaly is agitated, Anatoly. Its movement patterns are erratic. Its thermal signature is elevated. It is hunting for something, or it is being hunted. You will tell me what it is protecting on that ridge." Now, my silence was no longer a vow. It was a rapidly failing shield against the inevitable. The break came when the captain called me to his makeshift command post. My table was covered in high-resolution satellite maps and glowing laptop screens. He pointed to a thermal image showing a concentrated, steady heat source emanating from the exact spot Kolod had shown me. "That is not geology, Anatoly, and it is certainly not a fox den." He finally dropped the pretense. "We are not here for a mythical beast. We are here for the contents of Bunker 7ZV. He said the designation, and the blood drained from my face. "The Frostbite Project." He confirmed it. A ghost from the darkest corner of the Cold War. The steady energy signature they had detected from orbit was the failing power source of the bunker's cryogenic containment system. "Your creature," he said, gesturing dismissively at the screen where another, larger, mobile heat signature patrolled the area around the bunker, "is merely a biological interference, a problem to be solved. My entire world, my profound secret, was reduced to a tactical inconvenience on a military map." He told me the story then, his voice flat and detached, as if reading a historical report. The thing in the bunker was a prototype, a human subject from an early phase of the project, codenamed Xaver, the Beast. An attempt to create a super soldier who could operate in extreme cold, genetically engineered for heightened aggression, strength, and a complete indifference to pain. The experiment was a catastrophic failure. Xaver was uncontrollable, a feral killing machine. The project was scrubbed, and the subject was permanently cryogenically frozen in the mountain bunker, a monster swept under the rug of history. Now, after 50 years, the cryopod was failing. The internal temperature was slowly rising. They were here on a cleanup mission, to retrieve the asset before it thawed and unleashed itself upon a world that had no idea it existed. He wasn't here to hunt a myth. He was here to prevent a far more tangible nightmare from waking up. Kolod wasn't the monster, he was the cage. Then he delivered the final, devastating blow. He asked me about the storm, 42 years ago, on the exact date I found Kolod, he told me there had been a power surge at the bunker, a temporary malfunction. A different subject, a precursor to Zver, had partially thawed, breached its pod, and escaped. It was tracked and terminated on the glacier, but not before it damaged the primary containment unit holding Zver. During the incident, the captain said, his eyes locking onto mine, a piece of the damaged pod went missing. It was a small, layered alloy shard, a passive transponder. For 42 years, it has been emitting a faint, almost undetectable signal. It took our newest satellites to finally get a lock on it. It's what led us here. My act of mercy, the memento I had kept wrapped in Elena's scarf, the object that had started my entire secret life. It was a homing beacon. My terrible, private secret had been broadcasting my location to the world all along. "Where is the shard, Anatoly?" His voice was quiet, but the demand was absolute. My silence was my only answer. The captain stood up, his patience finally exhausted. "It does not matter," he said, his voice laced with the cold finality of an executioner. "We know where the bunker is." He walked to the door of the outpost and gestured to his men, who were already mobilizing, their movements precise and economical. "This creature of yours, this guardian, it is interfering with an operation of critical state security. It stands between us and our objective. Therefore, it will be neutralized." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. There was no room for negotiation. The great Ikimi Aten Eninor grinding machine of the state was in motion, and it would crush Kolod to get to the older, more dangerous monster sealed in the ice. My choice was stark and immediate. I could do nothing and watch them kill my only friend, or I could intervene, and in doing so, doom us all. The soldiers moved out into the snow, their dark forms vanishing into the twilight. The final confrontation had begun. I could not stay. I could not sit in my cage and listen on a crackling radio as they murdered the only soul I had spoken to in 40 years. My paralysis, the cowardice that had cost me Elena, would not claim him too. With a clarity born of pure terror, I went to my emergency research locker. Inside, beneath dusty geological survey equipment, were 3 small, percussion-activated demolition charges, meant for seismic testing. For creating controlled avalanches, I grabbed them, my hands steady for the first time in days. Volkov's men were taking the main trail, weighed down by gear, but I knew a different path, a treacherous goat trail, a razor's edge along the western face that would put me above the bunker. It was a path I had not dared to walk in 20 years, but tonight, my fear of falling was nothing compared to my fear of failing him. As I slipped out into the biting wind, I made a promise to the ghost of my wife. Not this time. This time, I would not be a spectator. This time, I would act. The mountain would have its say. The climb was a brutal, lung-searing agony. The wind clawed at me, trying to tear me from the rock. But my body, old and frail as it was, moved with a purpose it had not known for decades. I arrived on the ridge overlooking the bunker, my chest heaving, just as they finished their preparations. Below me, the scene was bathed in the cold, clinical glow of their portable floodlights. The Spetsnaz moved with a chilling, insect-like efficiency around the rusted steel door. One soldier was planting a shaped charge, its magnetic clamps clicking into place with metallic precision. Another was unspooling the detonation wire. Captain Volkov stood back, arms crossed, a dark statue against the snow, his face illuminated by the green glow of a data pad. They were so close. The silence of the peak was gone, replaced by the low hum of their equipment and the quiet, professional murmur of orders. I was a god on a mountain, watching ants prepare to break into a tomb, and I was utterly, hopelessly powerless. Then, from the shadows beyond the ring of artificial light, he came. Kolod did not emerge with a roar. He simply stepped into the light, a silent, colossal apparition of darkness and fury. He was bigger than I had ever seen him, his fur bristling, his presence sucking all the sound from the air. The soldiers froze. Years of training took over. In perfect, terrifying unison, their rifles came up, laser sights painting a dozen dancing red dots on Kolod's massive chest. The sharp, mechanical snick of safeties being disengaged was the loudest sound in the world. I saw Captain Volkov's mouth form a single, cold word: fire. My heart stopped. This was it. This was the end. I had led him to his execution. I squeezed my eyes shut, unable to watch, a silent scream trapped in my throat. I had failed. After everything, after 42 years of silence and shared grief, I had failed. I had brought the world's violence to his door, and he was about to pay the price for my mistake. But the volley of gunfire never came. A new sound ripped through the night, a sound that was not a roar of defiance, but the tortured scream of metal. I opened my eyes. Kolod had not charged them. He had done something far more shocking. He had ignored the soldiers, walked directly to the massive steel bunker door, dug his claws into the frozen seam, and with a grunt that seemed to shake the very bedrock, he pulled. The steel groaned, bent, and then tore from its ancient hinges with a cataclysmic shriek of shearing rivets and protesting metal. The soldiers stood dumbfounded, their weapons half lowered, their military precision shattered by an act of impossible strategic strength. Kolod tossed the door aside like a piece of cardboard. It crashed into the snow with a deep, final thud, leaving a gaping black wound in the side of the mountain. He had not come to fight them. He had come to show them they were aiming at the wrong monster. He did not give them time to think. He jabbed a massive, clawed finger into the yawning darkness of the bunker. From within, a faint, sickly green light pulsed, casting long, distorted shadows. It was the emergency light of the cryopod, the failing heart of the prison. The air that drifted out was colder than the mountain, a dead, sterile cold that carried the scent of ozone and something ancient and wrong. Then, Kolod turned his great head, his ancient eyes finding mine across the distance, a look of profound, weary duty. He slowly raised his other arm and pointed directly at the gnarled scar on his own shoulder. Then, with agonizing slowness, he pointed back at the pulsing green light within the bunker. The silent tableau was absolute, a message delivered with horrifying clarity. The wound, the bunker. He wasn't the escaped experiment. He was the guard. He was the last lock on a door that should never have been opened, a lonely sentinel standing watch over our sleeping demon. In that instant, the weight of my 42-year folly crashed down on me. The transponder, the shard I had kept as a token of my mercy, was the very thing that had guided them here. My one good deed, the choice that gave my life meaning, was the instrument of this disaster. I looked down at the soldiers. Their confusion was hardening back into resolve. I heard Volkov bark an order. Secure the asset, ignore the creature. They were going in. They were going to open the pod. And Kolod, I knew, would die to stop them. He let out a low, guttural roar. Ian, itatapiki enor. Not of aggression, but of grim finality. He braced his body in the doorway, a living wall of fur and resolve. He would fight them all. He would fight the whole world, and he would die here, on this mountain, because of me. My debt, paid in silence, had come due with catastrophic interest. I looked from the soldiers to my friend, then up at the towering, silent mass of the glacier hanging above us all. My scientific mind, my intimate knowledge of this place, saw the answer. My choice was made. It was not a choice for my life, or even for his. It was a choice for the mountain. I scrambled to the weak point I had mapped decades ago, a massive overhang of unstable ice held in place by a fragile rock bridge. This was the mountain's reset button. My hands were no longer shaking. I wedged the charges into the deep fissures, my movements sure and practiced. I was not a soldier or a killer. I was a glaciologist. And I was about to perform my final, most important act of science. I was restoring the natural order. Man's ambition had carved this wound into the peak, had planted this poison in its heart. Now, I would use my knowledge of the mountain's own power to seal that wound forever. I connected the last wire. I looked down one last time at the scene below. The foolish, brave soldiers, the waking monster in the pod, and the ancient guardian who had spent a lifetime holding it back. I whispered a final apology to Elena. Then, I pressed the detonator. There was no grand explosion, just a sharp, surgical crack that echoed like a breaking bone. For a moment, there was silence. Then came a deep, resonant groan from the heart of the glacier itself. The rock bridge shattered, and the overhang gave way. It was not an avalanche. It was the mountain falling. A solid wall of 1,000,000 tons of ice, rock, and snow descended with the slow, unstoppable force of geological time. It did not cascade. It collapsed. The sound was not a roar, but a deep, final sigh as the world erased a mistake. It swallowed the bunker, the pulsing green light, the shouts of the soldiers, and the last echoes of their ambition without a trace. It buried our sin under a new mountain of white. The floodlights winked out one by one, and the sacred, profound silence of the peaks rushed back in, absolute and victorious. Where there had been a scene of conflict, there was now only a smooth, pristine, and utterly empty slope of snow. The mountain was whole again. I am truly alone now. The avalanche I triggered sealed the only safe path down the mountain. My outpost is an island in a sea of impassable ice. The radio is silent. My supplies are finite. But the prison has become a sanctuary again. The silence is no longer heavy with guilt, but light with a strange, hard-won peace. For days after, the mountain was still. I did not see him. I did not hear him. I began to think he too had been taken by the ice, that my solution had cost me everything. I waited. Then, last night, as I sat watching the stars burn in the cold, clear air, I heard it. From the highest, most unreachable ridgeline, a place no man could ever stand. A single, low hum echoed across the valley. It was not the hum of warning. It was different. It was a vibration of acknowledgement, of thanks. It was a final signal, crossing the impossible distance, a farewell. The debt, at last, was paid in full. Our silent conversation was over. My name is Anatoly, and my time is short. I will die here, in this quiet place, the last keeper of a truth now entombed in ice. The moral of my story is not that man is the real monster. That is too simple. The truth is that our ambition, our relentless need to conquer and control, creates legacies so terrible that they require monsters to guard us from them. We build our demons, and then we are surprised when nature appoints a guardian to keep them caged. I will carry this secret to my grave, and the mountain will keep it long after. It has its own time, its own memory. The ice will hold the soldiers and their waking horror in a frozen embrace for 10,000 years. And somewhere, on the roof of the world, a silent sentinel continues his watch. He is no longer guarding our past. He is guarding our future. The mountain keeps its own time. Thank you for listening to my confession. My story is now yours to keep. If it has meant something to you, please show your support by liking this video, subscribing for more stories from the edge of the world, and sharing this with someone who understands that some secrets must be told. And now that the silence has been broken, I encourage you to listen to the next story recommended on your screen. There are more ghosts out there, waiting to speak.